publicly in the media and by think tanks and academics. The building of the legend of Osama bin Laden, the characterization of the Taliban as monsters, and then, of course, the whole discourse that was developed about Islamic fundamentalism and the great threat that Islamic fundamentalism posed to the West, the clash of civilizations discourse that was launched by Samuel P. Huntington and taken up by others. So the media and think tanks and universities were working overtime, preparing the public to respond to the plans once they were carried out in the way that was required. And as I've mentioned before a couple of times, they even went so far in July of 2001 to hype the notion that Islamic fundamentalist terrorists could hijack airliners and crash them into the Ducal Palace in Genoa, where the G8 heads of state were staying. And then after that very thing happened, at least planes crashed into the buildings. Don't know if there were any Islamic fundamentalists on board, frankly, especially because so many of the ones who were accused of having done it turned out to be alive afterwards and in foreign countries. Nevertheless, after planes crashed into buildings supposedly flown by Islamic fundamentalists, the authorities claimed that they'd never thought that anything like that could happen, and that's how come there was a failure in response to prevent that from happening. There's another factor involved, and this relates to planning and preparation, which is brought out very well by Webster Tarpley in his book 9/11 Synthetic Terror, which is a spotty book. It's not uniformly good, but he's interesting on the war games and the drills that were, as he claims, they're often used as masks for false flag operations that go live under the cloak of a drill. And there was a drill going on. There may have been 4 drills going on 9/11. Apparently there was a drill going on during the 7/7 false flag attack in London. So it's an interesting insight that he has. Tarpley identified 15 different war games and drills in the run-up to 9/11 in the years before that were related to air response to hijacked airliners, some of which the scenario was that they'd be flown into buildings, and some of these drills included scenarios where the airliners were flown into the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. So the claim that they had no idea that anything like this could happen just is obviously false. So now, having laid out the evidence for planning, I'd like to survey some of the complexity that exists behind the scenes where it's difficult to see. Here at Resistance Radio, we are dedicating ourselves to being fact-based, and that's the only way we're going to figure out what's going on is if we pay attention to the facts and don't let our predispositions take hold of us and distort our ability to see what the facts tell us. Nevertheless, because so much of what we're dealing with is hidden, is clandestine, we're required to make inferences from facts. And so our challenge is to make careful and rational inferences from facts. We don't want to be wildly speculative, but we also don't want to shut down the process of trying to infer what the facts may be suggesting, may be telling us, because we're afraid to speculate. So we have to infer, and that's a rational process. This is used in science all the time. We're dealing with clandestine forces, right? People behind the demolitions of the World Trade Center. At this point, we don't know exactly who it was. It was done clandestinely. And of course, 9/11 was much more than just the demolitions. The demolitions was the center, the focus of a much larger operation. There's a term for this study of clandestine realities, clandestine social forces. That it's called deep politics. This is a term that was coined by Peter Dale Scott. Or clandestine politics is another way to talk about it. And this is the study of hidden aspects of the political system. And in the clandestine or deep political realm, the most powerful centers of the ruling elite, of the ruling class, they compete for power. It's not an open process. It's not based on voting. Their power is based on wealth, and they compete with one another to set goals and advance their interests. But this whole domain of centers of power that are really controlling the government, for example, is hidden from us. And so all we have are clues and visible bits. And so we have to construct a picture of what lies unseen from these bits of information. So obviously 9/11, this is one of their technical capabilities. 9/11 is the world's most spectacular false flag operation. And 9/11, the purpose was to launch wars and to change the nature of civil liberties in countries all over the world. But there's lots of other methods as well as false flag operations that are used, and where clandestine political decisions result in other kinds of operations. For example, coups is an example. The installation of Bush in 2000 was certainly a coup d'etat, and that was all organized in the dark. Assassinations of key political figures is another tool. JFK, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, many others. The list of people who have been assassinated in the last few decades is very long. Kidnappings, disappearances, suicides, so-called suicides in quotes, kidnappings of important people. An example there is Aldo Moro, the president of Italy, who was kidnapped and then murdered. And then a whole list of other techniques, which formerly were considerably more hidden than they are now. Since 9/11, a lot of these techniques have actually been adopted by the government and are publicly visible. For example, torture and psychological operations. Mind control is another technique that is another whole domain of techniques. Suggestions have been made that suicide bombers and hijackers of airplanes who might crash them into buildings, these could be mind-controlled operatives. The CIA has been dedicated to developing and perfecting mind control techniques since the late 1940s. It was actually studied by the United States prior to that under earlier organizations. The CIA in the early 50s in Project Bluebird and MK Ultra, studied in great detail how to control people's minds. It's actually quite grisly material to get into, how people are rendered controllable, but the CIA has perfected these techniques. In addition, the clandestine powers that actually run the government, they employ death squads, and they also do things like cause people to be brought down by scandal and slanders and libel, and they put out all kinds of disinformation in the media. So there's a constant stream of disinformation that's developed clandestinely and then disseminated in the media. They have secret sources of funding from their control of black markets in drugs and prostitution and arms sales. And of course, they engage in insider trading. By the way, Kevin Ryan just published the day before he came on my show. He just published a new article that's related to his demolition access series on the people present at the WTC involved in preparing the demolitions. It's a worthwhile article. I've got a link to Kevin's article on insider trading just prior to 9/11. It's well worth reading. It's there in the resistradio.com/forum show page for today. And then, ultimately, behind the scenes, there is another giant source of power, which is the fraudulent economy that has developed, the giant Ponzi scheme that is run by the bankers, the highest insiders at Wall Street and other centers of financial power. So there are all kinds of resources available to this clandestine centers of power. And of course, it's quite complex. There are many different centers of power, and there's different types of centers as well. So, for example, we're familiar with we know the most about what I would call the operational arms that are employed, and these are a lot of them intelligence agencies like the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. I'm going to list several of these here, but this is not an exhaustive list. The NSA, National Security Agency, which specializes in electronic surveillance. The Office of Naval Intelligence, which was the very first U.S. intelligence agency. The Drug Enforcement Administration, which we now was running this operative who was involved in the Mumbai attacks, the Mumbai bomb attacks. The fellow Headley, he was a DEA agent while he was engaged in his terrorist activity in India. We've got the FBI. In the UK, we have MI6 and MI5. Israel's Mossad, Russia's FSB. And then we have the mafia and organized criminal syndicates in the U.S. and in all countries. We have the Vatican and Opus Dei. So they're these visible agencies, but much of the activity of these visible agencies is covert, and not only in the sense that they engage in covert operations, but some of the dimensions of their operations are not even publicly known, but only suspected. And they have secret sources of funding. They typically have much larger scale operations going on than are publicly admitted to. And one of the things that these operational arms do is they locate operatives in key locations throughout the societies that they're trying to control. So there are agents of the CIA in the Pentagon, in the military, in the police departments, in state governments in the United States, in the universities, in the foundations, in the non-governmental organizations, in all the media corporations. There are CIA agents, probably now DIA agents as well, and you can just generalize that most institutions in the hierarchically organized societies that we live in have representatives of these clandestine power centers in them to control and to keep an eye on operations in each of those organizations. So I'd like to just talk a little bit more about the CIA, and then I'll take a short break and come back. The CIA is largely visible. I mean, much of it is visible. It's the principal U.S. government intelligence agency, and it's supposedly controlled by the President and the National Security Council. This is how it was set up in 1947. But actually, the portion of the CIA that is visible and is under government control and is funded by the government is just a part of a much larger agency, really. And there's a researcher by the name of Tod Fletcher who's written a book called The Secret Team. He claims that the CIA is not really controlled by the President or the NSC, but is controlled by what he calls the